Welcome, dear learners. I'm Dr. Sucheta Shankar V, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Srinarayana Guru Open University. Today, we continue our exploration of B21EG01DC Introduction to Literature, where we give you an insight into all the major periods of literature in English, as well as give you an idea of what there is in different representative texts from these different periods. Specifically today, let's look at Block 3, Major Periods of Literature 2, and we go on to Unit 1, the Romantic Age. And here we go, let's look at Unit 1, the Romantic Age. When we talk about the Romantic Age, we're talking about a period between 1798 and 1860. It's very important to notice here that this is not a fixed time frame in which Romanticism emerged clearly, but rather we are talking about a general era when certain literary patterns emerged in English literature. We're quite familiar with the adjective romantic in our daily lives. We use it often to refer to a situation where fantasies and emotions triumph over reality. But have you ever wondered where this word comes from? It has its roots in the Provençal word romance, which refers to an old literary form where dreams and desires prevail over everyday realities. The heroes of these old Provençal romantic stories were knights and warriors. They would set out on adventures full of marvelous incidents and mysterious happenings. This, in fact, is the essence of the Romantic Age in English literature. Before we try to understand exactly what features define Romanticism in English literature, we need to think about what historical, social, and cultural changes brought about the emergence of the Romantic era in English. If you look at the world stage during this time, it was an age of revolutions, a period in European history when we can witness the American and French revolutions. Taking inspiration from these large-scale political changes, society too witnessed revolutions in almost all areas, be it political, social, cultural, economic, or technological. And we can see the evidence in the Industrial Revolution that broke out in Britain during this time. The embers of these changes had a great influence on British shores as well. There was a widespread call for democratization in political arenas in Britain. Many influential social circles saw the transformation of its institutions, such as marriage, religion, and family. The era saw calls for transformation of socio-cultural institutions. We saw widespread industrialization, which on one hand created a booming and prosperous economy, but on the other hand, it also created conditions of urban poverty, poor living standards, pollution, and widened class gaps. It was, as Charles Dickens would later say, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. It was altogether a huge change, a widespread transformation of society. And without doubt, this saw its reflections in literature. There was such a shift of literary and artistic sensibilities during this time. From the earlier neoclassical philosophy of literature, we can see a transformation towards what we today understand to be Romanticism. If you think back, what does neoclassicism talk about? It presents humans as inherently flawed. In effect, it upheld rational thinking, as superior to feelings or emotions. It talked about following the pattern or models of Greek and Roman classical art and literature. It gave great significance to form, order, and decorum. In fact, if you look at neoclassical literature, it discouraged experimentation and it discouraged deviations from established literary models. They insisted that writers should be self-restrained and should be refined. What this led to are very specific, repeated types of writings that lacked originality. With the shift towards Romanticism, we can find literature turning its attention to the inner workings of the individual writer's mind. What does this mean for us? This simply means that no single literary model could capture the unique emotions or viewpoints that each person is capable of. You and I are capable of different subjective expressions and thoughts. Such aspects cannot be expressed in a particular form, it cannot be expressed in a particular order, and nor could it be expressed rationally. Romanticism, or the new kind of literature that developed in this period, thus had to adopt new forms of expression. They had to present their radical view that humans are diverse and free. So then, what did Romanticism celebrate? It looked at the individual, the subjective, the imaginative, the spontaneous, and the emotional, and it presented all of these as valid, unique perspectives. It emphasized a sense of idealism and revolutionary zest. A common thread among the Romantics was a deep appreciation of nature, specifically as a source of beauty and delight. Romanticism placed emotion over reason and the senses over intellect. Human personality, moods, and mental activity would take center stage in Romantic literature. It was the creative spirit of the artist, his or her imagination, that had greater significance than the ability to showcase or follow rules. Folk culture, national and ethnic cultural forms, and there were references to the medieval that popped up again and again in Romanticism. There was also a turning to the mysterious and the supernatural. So we can see that Romanticism had completely changed the patterns and the rules and the traditions that were set by neoclassicism in the ages that followed. Throughout literature, something called the Romantic revival or the coming back of Romanticism was happening. Poets and writers started to show features of Romanticism in keeping or while keeping the kind of writing style that was followed during an earlier era. In fact, as far as Germany, the storm and stress movement was beginning, which is a forerunner of Romanticism. In this movement, they also celebrated nature, individuality, subjectivity, and extreme emotions in much the same way as the Romantics would celebrate it in Britain. So we can see that even this movement that was happening in Britain has its connections or roots in a movement that was happening in faraway Germany. The poets of this early period, in the early 18th century, are commonly considered to be the precursors of Romanticism or transitional poets. We say that they set the stage for the later emergence of Romantic poets. Some of the most significant transitional poets include William Cowper, George Crabbe, William Blake, Thomas Gray, and Robert Burns. These poets set the stage or created a literary scenario where Romantic writers could take over in earnest. But when we look at the history of the Romantic movement, the year that is constantly repeated is the year 1798, a milestone in English Romantic literature. This year saw the publication of Lyrical Ballads, a collection of poems written by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So, what was different about the publication of this collection of poems? For one thing, the work completely deviated from the poetic pattern of the age. The works in the collection used incidents and situations from common life as their inspiration for subject matter. In other words, this was not the poetry that used classical Greek or Roman milestones and models. This was not the kind of poetry that used incidents from the lives of kings or nobles, but from the life of the common man and of the everyday life that was followed in Britain at that time. Now, not only were the incidents drawn from daily life, but the language itself of this poetry came from the plain, everyday life that allowed ordinary subject matters to be presented in this poetry. And it was not just that the poem described the daily life. In fact, the subject matter was presented in deeply imaginative manners. What this did was that the everyday reader could read about something familiar or something from their everyday life in unusual and mysterious ways. So let's look at the way that William Wordsworth transforms the simple act of seeing daffodils into a deep emotional experience in the poem I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. They flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. This passion for discovering new pleasures in the ordinary world around them is a salient part of Romanticism. The idea was that literature would be open to readers from all walks of life, and they can identify the familiar and everyday world that they see around them in this new literature. So then, let's look at what are the different features of Romanticism in English literature. As we discussed earlier, one of the first and foremost features or characteristics of Romanticism is a reaction against neoclassicism. So, when we talk about Romantic literature, we are talking about simplicity of language, the focus on incidents from everyday life, the rejection of the neoclassical emphasis on rules and orders and convention. Romantic writers turned their attention to common life, to the common man, and more importance was given to spontaneity and originality rather than conventions and models. And Romantic literature also presented a sense of high idealism which was absent in neoclassicism. Secondly, Romantic literature placed great emphasis on imagination. The role of imagination in the works of Romantic writers is clear when we think just to the work of Samuel Taylor Coleridge in Kubla Khan. Remember, he talks about the pleasure dome lit in moonlight. Imagination itself was considered by Romantic writers to be a powerful tool of the human mind. In fact, when we look at the critical works of Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley, they have discussed the power of the imagination, of human imagination, to create and shape the reality that we see around us. The Romantics paid great attention to the representation of nature in their works. This creates another feature of Romanticism. Since they were writing at a point of time when industrialization was heavy and widespread, they considered that there was a need to return to nature so that there could be a balance in life. They presented nature as a source of spiritual renewal in their works. In fact, there are great, accurate descriptions of natural phenomena natural beauty, and the appeal of nature to the senses. The Romantics also considered emotion to be central to literature. Remember Wordsworth's famous definition of poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. The Romantic movement placed emotions as vital, just as feelings, intuitions, and impulses were vital to literature. This was celebrated in Romantic works of the period. The literature of the period came to be associated with expressing individuality and selfhood in unique and original ways, and this was only possible because of the focus on emotion. Another important feature that was connected to the expression of emotion is the idea of individuality. The unique, irrational, and emotional perspectives of the individual provided a variety of subject matter for Romantic writers. Romanticism also viewed the artist or writer as an individual rather than someone who copies earlier models. The writer is a creator in Romanticism whose output reflected his or her personality and mental state. Of course, the next feature is that Romantics converted events or incidents from everyday life into exotic subject matter for their poetry and other forms of writing. Just think back to John Keats's poem, Ode to a Nightingale, where the song of the nightingale becomes described as an experience that is deeply spiritual. The common everyday incident there, the song of the nightingale, is transformed into an exotic one. So Romantic writers would intermix happenings from common everyday life with fantasy and mystery. They would transform the very subject of their writings in a way that enriched their literary appeal. The final feature that we need to remember is the importance that Romantic writers gave to supernatural elements. In fact, Lord Byron has a poem called Darkness, where he talks about a mysterious setting where the bright sun was extinguished. Such references to the supernatural and the occult and happenings outside nature or outside ordinary happenings were very common in Romantic literature. Stories were often taken from mythical tales. There was imagery and symbols such as castles, dark forests, magical beings, and mystical visions and dreams that actually enriched Romantic poetry. In fact, such supernatural symbols were a way of exploring abstract and unexplainable ideas in Romantic poetry. While these features commonly appear in Romantic poetry, there are also several recurring themes that we need to notice, such as innocence, a celebration of rural life, the talk or discussions about dangers of urban society, pantheism, which is the worship of nature, and the placing of the self or the individual at the center of literature. These themes are typically presented in an emotional, subjective style, though each author and each Romantic artist has their own unique way of approaching these themes. Now that we've considered the different features and different themes that make up Romantic literature, let's take a brief overview of the Romantic writers and their different genres. The first and most popular genre in Romantic literature that comes to mind is Romantic poetry. The most famous of the Romantic poets, also known as the Lake poets, were William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Robert Southey. Now, all of these three writers were pioneers of Romanticism who indulged in emotion, individual perspectives, and a new writing style in their literature. Of course, after their period and slightly overlapping their period, later Romantics such as Shelley, Keats, and Byron continued the tradition of Romanticism, but with slight differences. Of course, there were minor poets who also belonged to the Romantic style in this period, such as Leigh Hunt. Another important aspect of Romantic literature is the prose writing of that period. The era saw three significant prose writers such as Charles Lamb, William Hazlitt, and Thomas De Quincey, all of whom had their own respective styles. Lamb followed a gentle personal style, whereas Hazlitt is renowned for the forcefulness of his prose. De Quincey is famous for the ornate style that he followed. However, in connection with Romantic prose, we also need to look at Romantic novelists of the period. And the most important names in this context are those of Jane Austen and Walter Scott. Now, as with the earlier writers, they had their individual styles. Jane Austen wrote novels that focused on domestic life, whereas Walter Scott presented the panorama of history. As with other literary periods in English literature, drama was prevalent during the Romantic era as well. And the most popular genre of drama during this time was tragedy. Romantic poets such as Wordsworth and Coleridge have composed drama such as The Borderers and Remorse, respectively. In these plays, they showed appeal to emotion rather than intellect. The protagonists were often rebellious, and the storylines promoted individualism. Another feature of drama during this period is the predominance of closet drama, or plays that were meant to be read instead of being presented on stage. This was also referred to as mental drama. Shelley's The Cenci and Prometheus Unbound and Lord Byron's Manfred and Cain are examples of this genre. Now, we have come to an end of Unit 1 of Block 3. And in this unit, we've looked at the basic background and history, as well as the features, themes, and important writers of this period. Thank you.